Hello and welcome everyone to the Solo Multimedia Podcast, where I give you my unfiltered take straight off the cuff. And today I'm going to be talking about the new vein.fn record, This World Is Going to Ruin You. And for those who don't know, I'm a pretty big fan of heavy music. I'm a really big fan of a lot of mathcore, especially stuff like Dillinger Escape Plan and The Chariot. And that's the kind of world that Vein sort of pull from, or at least it used to be. This record's a bit of a change for sure. But just before we get into that, if anybody's listening and, you're into Vein, you can get my thoughts on the first record on the video before this one. I covered Arizona yesterday because nothing else really came out that I was interested in. And I figured it would be good to talk about a record that's, at this point, really old. The last Vein record was 4 years ago. But I'm not going to tease too long on my thoughts on this. Basically, if this is the second record this band have put together, I can't fucking imagine what they're going to be doing next, because this is such a incredibly cohesive and just intense record that it's hard not to be in awe somewhat. There's so much detail across across all the songs here, really. And so many ideas as well. I mean, to some extent, I feel like it has less ideas than Arizona did. I feel like that record was still working out what it wanted to be to some extent, and this record definitely lands on something a bit less all over the place. But it packs just such an unbelievably visceral punch as a result of the trade-off. So, first off, the big difference, I think, between this record and the previous one is this record is definitely a shade darker. So for those who don't know, Vane play some pretty chaotic metalcore music with a good helping of kind of like alt metal and new metal and that kind of stuff. So there's like big chunky riffs, like really savage breakdowns, very frantic drumming all over the place, super intense harsh vocals, that kind of thing. And this record, essentially what they've done is they've just created the metalcore equivalent of a hell landscape. There are so many hellish sounds packed into this thing from front to back. The guitar tone is unbelievably heavy and noisy, and I can't believe they've brought it together in such a way that is so visceral, because wielded by a lesser band, I feel like this would have been uncontrolled chaos and felt quite sloppy. And I just feel like so many other bands would fuck this sound completely, because the guitars are just so heavy and distorted without feeling overproduced in that kind of like gent way. So it stays very like visceral, but it's so noisy, like in a very objective way. It's just such an incredibly loud sound. And to try and pack in riffs that are as crunchy and kind of like direct as these with a sound like that is just incredibly impressive. It's not really something I've heard a ton before. I really do think a lot of other bands would screw this up. And this MO is set out straight from the get-go. The first track, called Welcome Home, is a 2-minute kind of like industrial influenced collage of just hellish metalcore sounds. You've got this like ridiculously thick bass tone that holds the whole thing together, and there are just so many claustrophobic as fuck sounds across the entire song. It's not like an ultra strong song or anything, but just what a tone setter. I don't know how else to describe it. It absolutely grabbed me by the balls from the very first second, more or less, and I was pretty much in the entire listen. The next song on the record is called The Killing Wound, which is the first single they dropped, so I've listened to this one a decent amount. Essentially, you're getting a bunch of really heavy, frantic, kind of like breakneck speed drum fills and guitar riffs with like, loads of like nice guitar effects to catch the kind of sharper ends of the sound, but the majority is just very, very heavy, chunky metalcore riffing. The whole thing just goes off like a bomb. I love the subtle interplay between the guitars and drums. There's like shots of double bass or like drum fills that are matched with these like scraping guitar sounds that add a ton of viscera to the mix, while making sure that the chunkier, just more breakdown riffs hit as hard as they possibly can. The next song is called Versus Wyoming. It's another shorter song like Welcome Home, but I feel like they really up the samples on this one. The mix is just so claustrophobic. There's so much going on in just the minute length it runs. It does feel kind of overwhelming in a way, but at the same time, for me, that's like quite exciting. But on a first listen, I feel like a lot of people will definitely get bit disoriented and not sure what to make of the tracks. It flies by. It's like, yeah, like I said, 50 seconds long of just incredibly claustrophobic metalcore, mathcore riffing. This track probably draws more from mathcore than a lot of the other tracks on here, because one of the big changes on this record is, like I said, it's definitely less frantic and drawing from less areas, but it's also more just, there's a lot more just straight up metalcore riffing. And as a result, the whole record, just for the record, sounds a lot darker. It's definitely a shade darker than Arizona, which for me is probably a fairly big plus. I definitely think this is a step up I guess in not only like a visceral sense, but in like a kind of like defining what your artistic statement is going to be sense as well. Like the fact they've gone a shade darker, I think really works for them. Because they do just such a good job of making these really chaotic but still visceral and just awfully noisy songs, essentially. But the next song, Fear in Nonfiction, was another single that got dropped before the album, and I only listened to this once or twice, and I wasn't as into it as The Killing Room, but in this record, I think it actually makes a lot of sense where it is. It's probably the only particularly melodic cut on the first half of the record, really. And basically, the chorus on this thing feels very post-hardcore-y. It reminds me of something that Jane Doe era Converge would have pulled off, but the main riff is like just this huge slab of heavy notes with a slightly off-kilter rhythm and slightly off-kilter flavour. Then in the second half, they bring on a guest singer as a very melodic, very catchy kind of like core chorus with, very almost atmospheric melodic guitaring in the background. It's a little bit like, tiny bit like post-rocky, I guess you could say. That's probably a bit of a bastardization of the phrase, to be honest, but when you hear it, you'll see what I mean. And then the final moments are just a hellishly loud breakdown. The next song, Lights Out, kind of like Versus Wyoming, is just an ultra frantic song as you get tornado style like fills, shots of feedback and effects. Loads of breakdowns, or just kind of crashing into each other and warping each other out of focus. There's loads of horrible sounding scraping effects that I really loved. Wherever You Are is the first well-earned breather, I would say, after just all the chaos. And like I said, even Fear in Nonfiction is still a pretty heavy song, and that's the most melodic song really on the first half of the record. So this song is like just straight up a well-earned breather featuring a piano. Again, this one feels slightly Converge inspired, again, with the washed out vocals and kind of plenty of atmospheric effects. It feels like one of those more, I guess, like arty songs that Converge would have pulled together. But that doesn't, last all too long. Magazine Beach is another break from the sheer intensity. It's kind of structured like an alt metal song, but both this and Wherever You are pretty short songs. I think they're like 2 minutes 50 between both of them. So essentially, both of those are like a regular song, I suppose. But Magazine Beach feels a little bit more pulled from Deftones' camp. It's got that kind of more melodic, washed out guitar sound that you'd expect from alt metal. I do think this song felt a little bit underbaked. This is probably one of the only criticisms I have really of a particular song on the record, at least right now. This song really could have gone on for a fair amount longer. I felt like the song is catchy. It's not like incredible or anything, but I felt like the progression could have been a lot more interesting. But like I said, that's pretty much all you get in terms of a break. Because after that we go into Inside Design, which is just another ridiculously hellish metalcore tune. I love the shots of like drum fills between the really heavy guitars and vocals. That always is a trick that I quite enjoy. This tune blows by without maybe like the biggest impact, because at this point, everything on the record's been pretty intense for the most part. But it's still certainly thrilling, certainly very visceral, and I love the final breakdown with like the old school nu metal DJ scratching. That was a lot of fun. The next song, though, Hell Night, really, really brought me back in. The title kind of says it all, in my opinion, a little bit. The guitars on this track sound like they're screaming out in pain. There's so many effects layered into some of the guitar sounds that it almost feels like everything is just warped into some unrecognizable form, and there's this horrible noise break in the middle of the track that I really, really loved. And now would be a good time to mention, actually, one of the tricks that this band pulled together so well is, like I said, the majority of this record is going to be a lot of really like deep, really fucking heavy just guitar tones playing like kind of like fast, but not crazy fast, not like blast beat fast for the most part. Like breakdowny type riffs, like those mid-pace kind of like metalcore chugging riffs. And I feel like the majority of the soundscape is that, and delivered in such a noisy way that it all becomes very cacophonous and just incredibly overwhelming. But what they do is essentially it's like looking at a hellscape of fire and occasionally seeing some kind of like, I don't know, some big flare pop out above the like forest fire and just the hellscape beneath it, and you get this almost like beautiful brightness. And that beautiful brightness, in a sense, is a lot of the kind of sharper, louder, and I don't want to say more melodic, because they're definitely not. They're usually quite harsh, actually. But the more kind of like sharp guitar notes that sit over top of the mix and over top of all the hellscape beneath it. And it's almost got a kind of like it's almost got like an almost slightly like beautiful vibe, even though it mostly just adds to this just chaos that's laid out, in front of you. And Hell Night is definitely a track that really harnesses that kind of like tension, and I really, really appreciate that. I think Hell Night is probably one of my favorite songs on the record after a first listen. The next song is Orgy in the Morgue, which I guess we're going back to 2000s deathcore, but hey, whatever. This is kind of like one of the more disorientated and more like mathcore focused openings for a song on this record. This track didn't quite hit me as much as some of the other songs on this album. I feel like on the Arizona, a lot of the more mathcore songs, I really appreciated. Like Broken Glass Complexion ended up being like one of my favorites on the record. On here, I don't think it does in quite as much as something like Broken Glass Complexion, and as a result, it still sits in with the rest of this record cohesively. And that I feel like that almost works to its disadvantage a little bit, because this is one of the only moments on the record where I feel like it maybe just went a little bit too crazy with how like hellishly loud the guitar tones are, and it just became a bit too disorienting. But having said that, it still has a final breakdown that will just fuck every single thing up in history, because oh my god, it's very heavy. And then that's pretty much the majority of like the metalcore portion of the record. Then you have the final two songs, which make up 12 minutes. The record's only 32, so the first 10 songs are like 20 minutes, and then these last two are over, about half of that length, the 12 minutes, like I said. And you have the first one is Wavery, which is like a 4-minute, very alt metal song. It pulls again from the kind of the slightly more atmospheric book of Deftones, but it still keeps that very sinister vibe. And overall, it's just kind of like this mid-paced alt metal tune. The back half has a really heavy breakdown, which just makes sense. It fits the song, it fits the band. But for the most part, this is definitely a more melodic song. I wasn't as keen on this song, honestly. I think I almost would have preferred another just like a really heavy tune right here, but it's not a bad song. It's just kind of fine, I guess. Fortunately, though, the actual final song, Funeral Sound, I feel like perhaps isn't the most well fleshed out idea on the record, but they're at least trying something quite different. And for a 7-minute cut, I actually do like what they attempt here, even if it isn't stitched together in a way that I find as good as it could be. So essentially, the first half is a much slower, much like kind of calmer tune than even something like Wavery with the alt metal stuff. This is it's just like it feels almost something like Wretched World from Converge in tone. It's mostly driven by like clean vocals and piano. And towards the very end of like the clean vocals and piano section, you get these like drum samples that are dropped in. That like I said, they're just samples. It's not actually the drummer playing. And basically, they get dropped in to lift up the intensity ever so slightly, and then the whole song kind of cuts after a big bass hit that you would almost hear in like from the Inception soundtrack, I guess. And then you get this like vocal sample that's just like someone talking essentially. It's quite muted. It's a little bit hard to make out what they're saying. So I couldn't really make heads or tails of it, at least on a first listen. And that kind of like slowly just keeps going for like a minute or so, and then a guitar riff that brings in the final leg of the song kind of like rises from the mix, and then eventually the whole band kicks in, and it's not like terrible or anything, but I do feel like the way this was done just feels a little bit disconnected from the first half of the track. I get what they were going for, but I just feel like there must have been a better way to get here. Having said that though, this whole riff like eventually builds into this really like just very loud, very intense drum fill that goes on for like almost what feels like a clean minute. And all the guitars and the effects layer around this drum fill to really build something that feels just incredibly loud, quite melodic as well, but still frantic and chaotic and visceral. And overall, I feel like this song brought a ton of good ideas and is definitely a journey in the same way as like a longer Converge song would be. But I do just wish it was stitched together slightly more cohesively. But again, this is like a band on their second record, and to pull off something that's this ambitious, I think is very promising. And I mean, overall, this record is just, in case you can't tell, blown me away a little bit. It's whew, yeah, no, it was it was definitely a journey front to back. I really had a fun time with this. I can't fucking wait to catch them live again. Because I've only seen them one time in a tiny venue, and it was one of the better shows I went to that year for sure. It was an incredible show. A lot of fun for sure, and I think a lot of these tracks will only add to the kind of atmosphere they create live. So yeah, definitely really enjoying this thing. It's just incredibly visceral, incredibly hellish. Like I said, a shade darker than Arizona. I feel like that helps them get their artistic statement out there a bit more, which I'm really glad about. I love the extra samples used across this album. I feel like they're making use of that DJ slightly more than they were on Arizona, which is good. Overall, I'll just say one of the things that I guess is kind of interesting is this is one of the most intense releases I've heard in, I think, a little while, honestly. And I heard a lot of people talking about bands like Frontierer when it comes to just sheer intensity. And I feel like this is a type of intensity I wish we had more of. So Frontierer are a band that are incredibly loud and noisy, but it's very produced for sure. Like the riffs you get are just very disorienting. And while the guitar tone is very heavy, you can still, as you're listening to it, make heads and tails of more or less everything that's going on. It's just that what's going on is very chaotic, so it disorientates you in that way. And I'm not saying I dislike Frontierer, and I definitely think there'll be a lot of overlap in the fan base. But I do think that it's just, with that style of intensity, you end up getting a lot of stuff that feels like it's a lot less dynamic or interesting than it could be. And you end up just getting a ton of like really crazy riffs, which is definitely the case here. But I think the fact that this record does have a decent amount of dynamicism with some of the slower songs, some of the more like piano-led pieces, like the final song, and the fact that it all still fits cohesively together, I think really shows a case for this like noisier approach to writing this very intense music. Because I guess one of the biggest differences between something like this and something like Frontierer is that, to me, this right off the bat hits very viscerally. Like, you can get into this if you normally listen to this type of music very, very quickly. Like, there's nothing on here that's going to really like just send you through a loop and you're not sure what to do kind of thing. Whereas with Frontierer, I think it's a little harder to get into the grooves in as visceral a way, and it's more of a just kind of like just being beaten over the head with a hammer just over and over again without being able to necessarily like, without it giving you anything, I suppose, to some extent. Which I get is kind of the point. But for me, I definitely think the way Vein do Intensity is how I'd rather hear it moving forward. But hey, I guess we'll see. There's definitely a lot of bands out there that sound a lot like Frontierer, and I understand why. They definitely do something that is unique. This isn't like a knock on Frontierer. I'm just kind of, I guess, explaining some of the differences if you're used to intense music from a band like Frontierer to a band like Vein. I think ultimately, though, ultimately Frontierer is still like pretty cool band. I've seen them live; they're very fucking tight. But having said that, this is a discussion about the new Vein record, and yeah, this shit just goes hard as fuck. If you're into metalcore, you should really give this one a listen. I think this will basically be essential viewing in this year, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, big fan of this record. Can't wait to listen to it more. So, I hope that was insightful or interesting, or maybe just, I don't know, kind of masturbatory, but either way, I hope you enjoyed listening, and yeah, hopefully I'll see you guys around, alright? Peace out, everybody, stay safe.